problem solving. The second thing that we did was something called resource mapping. And the point of resource mapping is to get all the information into one place. And you know, some people might say, well, duh, that's very helpful, of course, that's why phone books were invented. But we found that that was a major obstacle for kids with disabilities and their families, is not knowing where to go if you needed some services or some type of accommodation that wasn't necessarily under the purview of the school because it was summertime. And so we created something called these resource maps for each community. So we were in 7 communities. This is a picture of the map that we created for Madison. It was an electronic document, and we used our website again, so very low cost. We had a legend and a description of what we thought should be in the map, but then we created a form on the website so that people could just enter information. So if we were at a community conversation and someone said, oh, I know of a transportation resource, we would take that information back and put it in the book. But we would also invite people to visit the website and do that. Again, the idea being to mushroom the total number of resources. So here's an example of an entry in the resource map, and this is just from Madison. It's a resource that was available. We geared it towards students or families who were looking for things to do recreationally. We did find that a lot of youth with significant disabilities were just sitting at home in the summer. And if we asked them, what do you want to do? They wanted to go out with their friends. They wanted to be involved in their communities. So one of the things that we tried to do is make sure that we also included, in addition to employment resources, other resources that would tap into recreation and interest that would also, we think, provide pre-vocational skills. Again, not our invention. These are 3 websites that are very instrumental in telling you how to create a resource map. It's pretty simple, low cost. The third strategy that we worked on was in doing something we called intentional planning. So for those of you who have been to IEP meetings, which probably everybody in this room at some point has either been to one or heard about one, it's a lot like IEP planning in the sense that it was intentional and it was individualized, but we did this with an eye towards summer. So we gathered through this information, we gathered what we thought needed to be on the plan, and we made something called the summer activities planning tool, which just asks questions. You know, who's here? Who's at this meeting? What is the big goal? What's the goal for life after high school? And then what are the short-term goals that we can address to get to that big goal? Now, it might sound a lot like a transition part of an IEP meeting, and we didn't want teachers to feel like they were doing something in addition to what they already had to do. Students were in charge of this, but we also did have somebody who is called a community liaison, which I'll show you in just a second, who helped facilitate this. And you know, that's, I think, one of the challenges for teachers was, is this going to be something over and above what we're already doing? And one of the ways that we tried to think of that, you know, problem solve around that is to say, you know, maybe you don't need this tool. Maybe this could be a part of the IEP. When you have a transition goal, you can say, how are you going to address this transition goal? I'm going to provide pre-vocational experiences in the summertime. Now, it might not be the school providing them, but one of the things that we found out, which I'll talk more about in a minute, is that kids, if they had their jobs in the spring, they're much more likely to maintain their employment through the summer. And so one of the things that we took away from that was, one of the lessons that we learned from that is spring planning, where a lot of IEPs are done in the spring. Spring planning could include vocational planning long term. So how can we get a job now so that we'll be working in the summer? And that tool, by the way, is one of the things that's up on the website that you can look at more closely if you care to. The fourth strategy was that we did have some community connectors. In all but one community, those were teachers, and they did receive a small stipend for participating in the project. In teacher interviews, though, when we talked to them about, you know, would you be willing to do this as part of your job, the number one thing they said was, yes, if I could get paid in the summer. And we looked at that and looked at the cost of, for example, ESY, extended school year, and we wanted to know, was there something that ESY could be doing, or is there a way to push those resources around to, yes, pay teachers for the work that they do in the summer, if this were a model that could be followed, or does it have to be this traditional classroom-based, and if it is classroom-based instruction. And so those were some of the questions that we were asking all the while. The community conversation, the community connectors, they participated in the conversation and they facilitated, these are their roles. They facilitated the planning meetings, and they just sat down with students to ask them, what are your interests and goals, and what can we do to meet those? So where can events change? They also collaborated with our business liaisons to identify job options, and this was one of the things that the teachers later, or the community connectors, all but one were teachers, where they said this was one of the most helpful things that we did, was get together with members of the business community. We were very involved and actively engaged with the chambers of commerce in each of these communities. And so we asked them to come to the table and share with us, what do you expect from youth? A lot of businesses hire kids in the summer. So what do you expect of them, and how could that work with youth with disabilities? And then to make those initial connections, and then to follow up with them to make sure that progress was being made. And I think that's probably the most intensive demand. In our case, it was a community connector. But if this project takes place in a community, one of the most intensive demands is following up, particularly with students with severe emotional and behavioral disabilities, because we found that a lot of times they are more likely to quit, or they encountered problems with their bosses or their coworkers that were related to social skills, and they really needed somebody to go to problem solve before it got to the point of quitting or getting fired. And so then that brings us to the fifth strategy. And I feel like I'm talking really quickly, so I'll try to slow down if I need to. The fifth strategy was the business liaison, and that's what I've been mentioning, is looking at the presence of the Chamber of Commerce and how to make those connections. One of the things that we found out that none of us knew on the project before we started was that chambers have a certain percentage of their annual budget is devoted to youth employment and to doing things within these communities. So how do we say, hey, we're here, use that money in this way, or maybe not even money, but use those efforts in this way, and who do we connect to? So those were the five. Let me just say a few more things about the employer liaison. The employer liaison was actually expected to do very little in the way of working directly with youth. It was more, come to the community conversation, help us get information, help us introduce employers who are looking for good kids to work to kids who really want to get jobs. So it was more of a connecting piece. They didn't have a part necessarily in some of the planning pieces. Now, if a youth wanted to get a job at a certain business and they knew that connection was possible, they could say, and they did so in this project, can you come to my planning meeting? And in some cases, employers did do that. They took time out of their busy days to do that, primarily because most employers do value a strong working force, and they saw the value in what it would be like to get together with the kids who are looking for jobs. So we tried to look at what was the effect of this project. And we looked at kids in the intervention versus kids in a comparison group. And this is kids, this bar graph represents kids with severe disabilities. But we did have a statistically significant gain in employment for kids who were in this intervention group versus kids who just had business as usual. And that was very exciting for us, because we thought, here are some things that actually required very low resources that had real effects in the lives of kids. And so some of the inspiring stories that we had at the community conversations, for example, donut shop owner came to one of them, said, I'm looking for 3 kids who can work, hired one of the kids who was at that meeting. Now that's an anecdotal piece of evidence, but it was important because it was inspirational to see people talk about opportunities with people who are looking for opportunities, especially when in the interviews we learned that oftentimes it's the lack of the knowledge of the opportunity that stands in the way of getting the job. Still though, we see we're just slightly under youth without disabilities for employment. Some of the jobs that these kids had, they worked in offices, they did all sorts of clerical type work. They worked in food service, they worked in landscaping. Here's a little bit more information about the youth in the intervention group. Their average hourly pay was $6.53 an hour. They worked an average of 11 hours a week, almost 12, and summertime, some of them that was probably by choice. Now, about 77% of them were checked on by that community connector that I mentioned. And that's a big piece. That's probably, again, the most resource-heavy piece that would have to be implemented. Yes?
Just clarify something on the previous slide.
Yes.
What is the point of the youth without disabilities in the middle?
That is their level of employment in the summertime.
So youth without disabilities are around 70%.
I think
And
so,
you're
yes.
saying
It's a little bit higher than 70, yeah.
And you're saying in the intervention group, that's what you got to?
They were almost,
Close.
there's a little white line right here,
Right.
so they're not quite
Not
at the
quite,
top.
Got it.
They're about 2% off.
Thank you. Still a remarkable.
Yeah, it was really, these results were exciting. Now, I'm going to show you the kids with emotional and behavioral disabilities in a second, which was less exciting,
Can I
yes.
ask a question? How often, you say checked on, did you keep track of how often they were checked on?
We really didn't. I mean, we asked the community connectors afterwards to report back to us about how often and what kind of checking. Did you call them?
Right.
Did you visit them? None of the connectors did site visits at work like a job coach would. It was not very intensive checking.
Okay.
But it was phone calling, and also, sometimes that planning session that I mentioned may have happened in the beginning of the summer, and then at the end of the summer, they said, how did it go?
Okay.
So it could have been very low impact.
But
We
not
didn't,
necessarily like a job coach. so-
it wasn't like a job coach.
Okay.
And, we made that decision, that it's interesting because the reason for that decision was that these people were volunteering to be in our research project, and they were essentially unpaid. They had a small stipend.
Right.
But we were trying to figure out what would be the least intervening intervention, if that makes sense, at that rate, yeah.
I'm just wondering, what is the actual age group you're talking about?
Well, for a paid position, it would have been students who are 16 years older.
Okay, so is this first-time employment for most of these kids, or?
Not for everyone. I mean, some of the students were in, 18 to 21 age bracket because they were aging, they were still within the system. So it depends on the youth. For the youth with paid employment, they were eligible for paid employment. There were some youth who were, doing volunteer type or recreational type activities, but that specific slide was to paid employment, so they would have had to have been eligible by state law for employment. And age is a big factor, and that's something that the National Longitudinal Study shows very clearly, is that, as students age, their employment rate will go up because they'll have more opportunities.
And I just wonder if down the road, if there'd be a way to find out if, you started this process with students at 16 and it kind of followed them up through and found out that it stuck with them. Because the earlier you start, is that going to determine the success rate as they go into adulthood and leave the system?
Well, there is national data that shows that is definitely the case. I mean, in the national data, the most predictive factor, the most, the predictor of success in adulthood and employment is early work experience, which is one of the driving ideas behind the project. But there were kids who did jobs that, sometimes are in that gray area, like lawn mowing, being self-employed, doing babysitting, things like that. So I think that's also, where some kids do get early work experiences prior to being employed outside the home or by someone else.
If a kid had a job and then got fired after a month, where do they appear on the data? Are they considered having had employment?
They are considered having had employment, but we did, in that particular graph, but we did do multiple checks at this. We started at the beginning of the summer, and then we also checked on them at the end of the summer and asked them, are you employed? Is it the same job? And then if they said no, we asked them, did you get fired? Did you quit? And then what are the reasons for that? I don't have slides depicting that level of detail, but yes, they are represented in that slide.
That greatest predictor you mentioned, that's paid work experience, is it not?
It is, yes. But I guess one of the things that we were thinking in this project is that some of the unpaid experiences will lead to the paid experiences. So we did, for example, have youth who volunteered at an animal shelter or something, and through that we hoped that they would make some connections. Type of work, 27% are in cleaning industry, about 22% in assembly work, 22% also in animal care, and on down the line. And again, this is youth with significant intellectual disabilities. So it's interesting to think about. The types of employment surprised me a little bit. I was thinking that they would be stuck in some usual job of shredding paper somewhere, but really they had a variety of experiences. Now we'll look a little bit at youth with emotional and behavioral disabilities, and you can see that the results, they were not statistically significant. So they weren't as positive as the results for youth with significant disabilities. We did have an increase of 43% in the intervention group versus 33% in the control group. But we still had a lot of youth that didn't find employment, did not find consistent employment, did not find any employment. And we also had another problem, which was not true of the youth with significant intellectual disabilities, and that was that these youth are much harder to reach. So a lot of this depended on us staying in touch with them to know whether or not they had jobs or to know how they were doing. And it was difficult. And a lot of you are nodding your heads probably because you've experienced high mobility and some of the other issues that are associated with the difficulty of following up with youth. So a little bit of gain, but not enough to be statistically significant. Their hourly pay is $6.83. Average hours, 19.9. It's almost 20 hours, more hours a week. And that wasn't surprising to us. We thought that would be true because that is the national data also show that youth with EBD tend to work more than other groups, but that they aren't necessarily consistently employed. That only 30% were checked on, so that's interesting. We don't know exactly why that is, but one guess that we have is that people perceived that they were more competent or perceived that they need less support, and so checked on them fewer times. But again, we were talking about 7 people, right? So we had 7 connectors who worked with these students. So that's another thing to take into consideration. And you know, in the intervention group, about almost 38% started the job in the spring, which was true for more of the students outside of the intervention group, which is interesting. So one of the things that people have written a lot about at the national level is that youth with EBD actually are trying to work quite a bit during school. And there are lots of different reasons for that and lots of different theories about why that's true. But again, it's supporting them through the consistency of that employment. And if you look, 30% are at food service, so a little bit different there. 15% are in cleaning, and about 19% are in, it looks like grounds maintenance. Okay, let me check on the time here.
It's 10:17.
So what I have left to do is to talk a little bit about some of the other types of data that we collected. I mentioned that it was a phased project. It was over 3 years. What I just showed you was actually implementing the intervention, the 5-piece intervention. But while we were doing that, we were also trying to figure out what perspectives the stakeholders had in this process to make sure that we were tailoring the intervention to meet the needs that were really out there. This is about, we did do adolescent focus groups, and we asked adolescents what their summer expectations were, or their expectations rather of summer employment. We also asked them, how they pursued summer employment, and we asked them what their expectations of parents and teachers were. We also asked them about their supports and barriers. And so what we were really trying to figure out is, do youth with disabilities, are they unemployed less because they try less, they have fewer strategies, or is it fewer opportunities, and how can we try to influence some change in those with the barriers. Our focus groups are small, as you probably know from focus group research. So we had 16 participants, 7 were females, 9 were male, and their disabilities included cognitive, learning, and emotional behavioral disabilities. They involved 2 Latinos, 6 African Americans, and 8 European Americans. And this was an interesting thing. All of the youth who volunteered for focus groups were eligible for free and reduced lunch. So that really then gave a certain lens or perspective to the things that the students were saying, because they had this common shared experience of having fewer economic resources at home. And one of the things that came from these focus groups is that these particular youth talked a lot about working in the summer not as a choice, but as a reality, as something that they needed to do, sometimes to help their families, sometimes to support themselves and to just stay afloat. But that they felt a real drive to have not only summer employment, but after-school employment, yes.
Is this the social justice component of your study?
Well, I would like to think it's all about social justice because work should be an option for people who want to work. The opportunities should be out there. But I do think that it is important to consider that those differences might occur across race and ethnicity. They might occur across economic status because of the resources that people have access to. And I think that, you know, the whole project really does try to address that. And then these interviews were conducted in 2008. So some of the things that came from this interview, the interview research, was that the adolescents did value summer experience, particularly paid employment. 1 out of 16 had an internship. And we looked at that as an unfortunate thing because internships, again, are normative. So how do we increase internships and their availability to youth with disabilities? We also found out that teens were able to list a lot of strategies that they use to find jobs. And that was heartening because they talked about filling out applications, they talked about talking to their parents, they talked about talking to their teachers. Unfortunately, they also talked about a lot of barriers. So they were applying for jobs, wanting jobs, but not receiving jobs. So trying to figure out what were the mechanisms that were preventing that. Teens also said that they valued their free and recreational time. Very big surprise, I'm sure. They used public sports facilities, libraries for internet access, and just hanging out. One of the things that was really impressive to me in talking to the youth, and I was the researcher who did the focus group interviews, was that every youth in the study talked about going to the library in the summertime constantly. And most of the time it was about internet access, but not always. And some of the time they talked about using internet access to look for jobs. And so, you know, to hear the youth talk about that was great because they, in some ways, were empowered. But thinking about things like the digital divide and whether or not they had access to the internet when the library is closed or when their local library is closed permanently, then what happens? Supports that seemed to be limited included the fact that they didn't necessarily know where to go to once applied, how to follow up. They needed a little bit of coaching in terms of how to make the connections with people in positive ways. They talked about calling and saying, hey, did you look at my application? And in sometimes the ways that they talked about that seemed to be a little bit menacing. And so you wondered if they were making appropriate connections and then who was helping them do that? Who was talking to them about, hey, when you call your future employer or prospective employer, you might want to, you know, use your business skills or use your, you know, the proper social skills. Teens also identified that parents rather than teachers were a major support for finding and maintaining jobs. And this was important because teachers, you know, had already voiced that they were concerned that they weren't employed in the summertime and they weren't equipped to get all kids jobs in the summer. So knowing that a lot of the teens went to their parents was a good thing. But we also knew that as kids who were eligible for free and reduced lunch, a lot of their parents also were unemployed. And so what were the connections there? Were they viable connections leading to employment? Maybe, in many cases, maybe not. Missing from the teens' comments were also anything that would indicate that they had complex social networks that served to extend access to these opportunities. So, you know, they didn't necessarily talk about being members of clubs, of social clubs, or of recreational activities that would extend who you know in your community and the people you know who know other people who need to hire people. And so that was something that we wanted to draw attention to. I mentioned the interviews already. Teens also reported frustration with mismatches between the job interest and the job duties, between their interest and the duties, and they often talked about job abandonment. And the thing about this is that a lot of the jobs they were talking about were jobs that were arranged through vocational support at school. So the transition coordinator might have been helping get them a job at a fast food place. Very common example given by the teens. And the teen said, yeah, I worked there for a couple of days and then quit. And so it's trying to think about ways to use the material from what we collected with the transition assessment to say, here are the real interests, here are the real skills of this individual, what is the best place? And also making sure that the teen was realistic about that, you know, that they're going to get a job that they have the skills to do. And then numerous of the kids mentioned challenging peer and employer relationships, and that those tended to be a reason for oftentimes quitting or getting fired, is getting into arguments or not being able to take orders from a supervisor in a work position. So then, you know, a lot of teachers, a picture of the first day of summer, teachers excited to leave school. So you can imagine what teachers, you know, at least in the beginning, their first idea is about something to expand services to the summer was, wait a minute, who's going to pay for that? How are we going to do it? But really, in the beginning, we just wanted to talk to them about their expectations, about who they thought was helping students get these jobs, whether or not they thought these jobs were important. And we talked to 14 teachers. All of them were special educators. They were from around the state. Their average years of experience were 16.5. And they're from 10 different schools from 7 cities. And you can see that we tried to vary large to small schools. And these interviews were actually conducted before the student interviews. So they sort of informed the questions that we wanted to ask students. Teachers categorically said, yeah, summer's important, but who's going to do it? The barriers that they identified was, you know, how to get the configuration of labels and services. So they're special ed teachers. They're in that mindset of how do we make sure this kid is eligible for something like ESY, and then how can we make ESY look different from what it already looks like, which is come to school, do this program, remediate. But if we're really going to be ESY, that might be, how about a vocational experience? That's really different from what we already do. And I only have a really, really small percentage of my kids who are qualifying for ESY in the first place. So that was part of the barrier. Another barrier was the shortage of opportunities in smaller communities. Some of the barriers weren't school-bound, obviously, and I'm sure all of us are aware of that. And in fact, you can imagine it, this project went from 2007 to 2010. The economy was obviously falling at that point. And so some of the jobs that we saw kids get slipped away right before our eyes. And that was just an economic reality. And then the shortage of logistical supports, finding jobs for kids and then not being able to find transportation, for example. Then we also wanted to talk to members of the Chambers of Commerce, members of the employment community to find out what it is they thought youth needed. And this is some really interesting data, and it's right here at the end of my time, so I'm going to have to go through it a little bit quickly, but I do think it's worth it because it's very interesting. First of all, there aren't very many of these types of surveys that really ask employers to think about kids with disabilities as employees. Our questions were like this. We wanted to know, to what extent do chambers of commerce and other employer networks consider various youth-focused support activities to be feasible? What do they think they can do with youth to create jobs? That was the first thing. Then secondly, what, if any, experience had they already had implementing these activities? Were they doing youth employment type activities? And then lastly, do they think these activities are feasible for kids with disabilities in addition to kids without disabilities? So what we did was we designed a survey to send to all the chambers, and we made 2 surveys. One survey said, will you do these things with youth? And the other survey said, will you do these things with youth with disabilities? And then we sent them to the separate, obviously, we divided the sample and sent them out. And so, for example, we asked this on the survey. Our organization could partner with our local high school to co-sponsor a job fair. Well, interestingly enough, if we said youth with disabilities, about 36% said, yeah, we could do that. But if we didn't say youth with disabilities, about 55% said that. And really, that's true all throughout the survey, that if we didn't mention disability, the employer was much more likely to say, yeah, we could do that, we could collaborate. And what we argue is that some of the types of collaboration aren't very different for youth with disabilities. And so where is the barrier? Is the barrier an attitudinal one? And then how do we get to that? How do we address that barrier? When we talk to employers, one of the comments that was routinely shared with us is that we don't, we would say youth with disabilities, and the employer would say something like, oh, you mean like someone who uses a wheelchair? And we would say, well, it could mean that, but we also mean youth with learning disabilities, youth with emotional and behavioral disabilities. And particularly with EBD, the employers would say, whoa, wait a minute, what do you mean? What does that mean for us? And so part of it, at least, is really helping share some information and, demystify what it might mean to work with youth with disabilities. But in addition to that, there are some hard questions. So what do you do to really work with youth with disabilities?
Who was it sent out to? Is this our organization? Was it just chambers? Or
It was all chambers across, every
all
chamber
chambers.
in the state of Wisconsin.
I guess I'm somewhat struck by the low number, all the way around, even on the right side.
Yeah, it's pretty, it hovers right around 50%, between, just under 60% and a little under 50%. Especially when you consider that chambers have, as part of their budget and as part of their mission, to work with and create youth employment. Albeit not their main mission, but at least part of it.
Do you have an idea of what that means financially, like a 10% of their budget?
No, I think it's way less than 10%, and I can't quote the number, but I want to guess it's right around 5 or less.
Okay.
5% or less. Let's see here. So I think I'm going to stop there because I'm out of time, and then just open it up for a few questions or comments. Yes.
My first question is, what are the limitations to what you've done here? In other words, is this pretty much the picture in Wisconsin, can you say, of things? Or is it limited to, this is what it looks like around Madison?
Well, so it depends.
And it leads to the next question, which is, so what, has this data been shared with, for example, Linda Materjean with
Yes.
Wisconsin State
Yeah.
Transition Initiative as part of the conference? It seems like some pretty valuable information.
Yeah, and Linda has been a great friend to us and really involved